This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity, kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergant. This day, well, we're a couple days early here, but it's December 18th, 1971, which is the day that we are marking here, and that is when the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was signed into law by President Richard Nixon. This, at the time, was the largest land claims settlement in United States history. This was a compromise between the U.S. government, the state of Alaska, and Native groups, and what exactly did it mean? Well, it settled claims on land from Native Alaskan groups, meaning all Aboriginal land claims were now extinguished, but in return, it established that millions of acres of land and about $1 billion in support would be distributed to Native communities, but through the establishment of local and regional corporations. These corporations would then engage in business ventures, mining and oil and tourism and more, and distribute their profit back to their shareholders, who in this case are members of their respective indigenous groups. Which is all to say, Nixon in this moment is saying, welcome to American-style capitalism. And, as is the case, this led to some real winners and some real losers and all sorts of interesting cascading effects from this. So let's talk about this system of land claims and corporations in Alaska and how that differs in many ways from the ways that things were settled in the so-called lower 48, and why it was Richard Nixon who was behind all of this. So, here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
We should give a shout out to emailer Travis, who suggested we do this, and Travis went out of his way to say, I find this interesting and somewhat esoteric, so I thought I'd pass it along, and well done, Travis. And Travis, I think, is from Alaska and has talked about, and really framed this nicely for us, so thank you, Travis, for that email. Before we get into it, that phrase I used, the lower 48, I've been thinking about that phrase because Hawaii is further south than almost all the rest of the U.S. So I don't know what you call just the non-Alaska.
Wouldn't it be the lower 49?
It'd be the lower 49 or the but you can't say the contiguous. I guess it's the contiguous continent.
I can't imagine why they say lower 48 instead of contiguous lower 48.
Right.
Mystery.
Right. The contiguous continental non-Alaskan states. There you go.
That's too much. You're doing too much.
That's not what we're here to talk about. We are here to talk about this admittedly kind of wonky seeming bill, but we won't get into the super details of these corporations and the shareholders and how the money was distributed. But, I think I did try and highlight some of the sort of interesting top lines. But NIki, kind of what stands out to you about how this shifted the relationship between tribes and the U.S. government?
Well, I mean, it seems to have been one of the most honorable deals that the U.S. government made with any group of indigenous people.
Low bar.
Right. Yeah. One of the most striking things about it is that the U.S. government hadn't made any treaties or deals with indigenous people in Alaska. So when Alaska became a state in 1959, the Statehood Act was kind of like, look, we're going to hold everything at the status quo. We're not going to mess with any of your indigenous land claims. And when it came time to sort of figure out all of these land rights, as competition over oil in Alaska started to heat up, Richard Nixon, hats off to him. He was like, you know what? What if we treated indigenous people well and like people instead of in corrupt and bloody and terrible ways?
Yeah, that part for me, I think, is the most shocking. We've talked about Nixon before and some of his more progressive ideas, and this idea that he is really trying to give Native American tribes self-determination, allow them to maintain their land and not be swindled out of money. Because I think that's a big part of the historical narrative in the United States is you get all of these treaties that are either not honored or turn out to be scams or undermine the political or economic power of Native Americans. And so this is a moment, a huge moment, really, to actually do right by the Native people and make sure that, you know, their livelihoods are protected.
So worth pointing out, I mean, this is clearly a compromise, right? I mean, there's surely voices that are saying, you know, this is our land. We just want our land and leave us be. And so this is part of a way to get to, you know, you're still a state, you're still American citizens, you're still part of this system, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about it that, like, you know, in other parts of the United States, it's part of the tragedy in the story of treaties is that, you know, it's a broken treaty is then built upon a broken treaty, built upon a broken treaty, and it just goes and goes and goes for centuries. Whereas here, in this weird way, you know, as you're both saying, there's a sort of quote unquote fresh start, blank slate on which to negotiate an initial kind of comprehensive treaty.
And we don't have to attribute it necessarily to the soft heart of Richard Nixon. Right. I mean, we are also in 1971, which is in the middle of the indigenous rights movement in the United States, where there's real visibility around the American Indian movement, Red Power. All of these things are happening right at this moment. And here is an opportunity to actually do something good. And one of the things that Nixon does is actually pretty cool is that the U.S. had this policy. You know, we've talked about boarding schools for Native Americans and that kind of cultural annihilation that the U.S. was involved in. That idea of Indian termination, which was about terminating the way of life of indigenous people, Nixon is like, let's not do that anymore.
Yeah.
And that's pretty cool.
We're not going to push for assimilation. We're not going to push for these boarding schools. We're actually going to try to protect Native American sovereignty.
Right. And the rhetoric turns from termination to determination. Self-determination is the word that Nixon begins to use as part of this. And, you know, a lot of this also relates to the larger civil rights movement and fights for political power. But really, you know, it seems like the questions of political power are slightly put to the side here, and it really focuses in on a kind of economic transaction and economic structure. And that, I think, is the most interesting part of this story to me. And, you know, about 10 years later, the New York Times runs a headline called Alaska's Natives Try a Taste of Capitalism, which I just think is an, you know, interesting framing and interesting summation of this. And so, Kellie, you know, what is your sense of, like, that's really what's happening here? It's like, welcome to American-style capitalism.
I mean, what's more American than capitalism?
Corporations, stockholders, shareholders.
I know. In some ways, I think that it is a very sort of common traditional way of engaging land policy and like native or indigenous sovereignty. This way of saying, like, we're not just going to take the land. We're going to make it so that you can make a buck, so that you can have some sort of investment, and you can choose to do whatever you want with that investment, how you want to spend it. But, like, I think that's how a lot of Americans understand power, is through their ability to generate wealth, income, and have some sort of economic control in that way. And again, this is something that, you know, Native Americans have not traditionally been given that space to do that. So it's complicated, but at the same time, it's a whole lot better than nothing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, like most things, it's, I think, a balance, right? And if we think about like economic power and agency and, you know, socio-cultural, political agency, it's like you need both. And I mean, for whatever reason, I'm thinking about 40 acres and a mule or reparations, you know, and sort of a push for like, well, okay, yeah, maybe you gave us the vote, but, you know, how about some actual sort of economic support here? And I think the answer is...
it doesn't put jobs on the table.
The answer, of course, is both. But it's interesting how this largely tilts towards a sort of economic solution.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe. And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
And economic solutions are going to be the pathway moving forward after the Great Society. As you get into the 1970s and 80s and 90s, both parties kind of decide that, well, maybe capitalism will fix everything. And this is part of that. And for Richard Nixon especially, Richard Nixon is such an interesting figure in all of this because he's never just doing it to do a good thing, right? This makes me think about things like his guaranteed annual income, this idea that he was going to give everyone a check as opposed to using the welfare state. So he wanted to dismantle the welfare state. His Philadelphia plan, which was ostensibly for a very good cause to hire more minority workers, but he was actually using it as a wedge to bully and tear apart trade unions. So there's always like another edge to everything that Nixon is doing. And in this case, like capitalism is something that's good for these tribes potentially, but it's also good for the oil companies who want to take advantage of these lands.
Let's not forget about the companies, the corporations.
Yeah. So before we describe that corporation system and how it integrates with the larger economy, I just want to point out in the intro, I mentioned how this is an interesting comparison to how a lot of these issues were resolved in the lower 48, to continue to use that imperfect term. So imagine, no reservations are being set up here, right? Which is often the answer.
Yeah.
And in this case, right, it is, to Nixon's point, it is self-determination and an integration of sorts into an economic system. So it's just an interesting, it's just worth highlighting that was not the path that was taken in this moment. So this corporation system, you have all these tribal groups basically establish corporations. Those corporations are supported through money and through land rights. And then every citizen becomes a shareholder in that corporation and receives a certain amount of money. We don't have to get too in the weeds of that. This doesn't need to be a shareholders meeting. But what are the ways in which these corporations start to operate? And Travis's initial email really pointed out some interesting ways in which now these native corporations are kind of working the system and making some real money. But, what's the landscape as you see it?
So the landscape is kind of the landscape because the biggest resource that these tribes have is land. And then they also have about $1 billion that's flowing through these corporations. And so they can do all sorts of things. They can sell mining rights. They can sell oil rights. They can set up tourist industries. And the corporation can make money based on all of these natural resources that these tribes have access to through the land. And then, again, like as money comes in, these corporations can create jobs, but they can also then disperse the dividends of the money that the corporation is making back to these members of a tribe. So it's literally a corporation that's looking to make money.
Yeah. Each, Alaskan individual is given about 100 shares. And that shares, you can choose to do what you want with it. You can't sell it, which I think is really important, but you can inherit it. You can give it away. But it's something that can be maintained for a long time as long as you're not giving it away and create sort of systemic wealth.
Right. And that wealth, then comes back to the communities. And I think, this email we got from Travis pointed out that, it creates this interesting tension or system or potentially, at times, workable system in which there's native communities who are continuing to support their native way of life, but they need to play the American dollar game. And so there's dollars coming in. Yeah. Those are being used to plowed back into kind of more older and different systems of life. One other distinction worth pointing out, and Travis points this out too, is a lot of these corporate projects are not on native land or even in Alaska, right? These corporations own hotels in Seattle. They do subdivisions in San Antonio. I mean, they are operating like big multi-state corporations just because they have a bunch of money and they have an incentive to make money and so forth. But that is an interesting distinction. I mean, I think we all understand how, native tribes have embraced capitalism in different ways, but this one is interesting in that it is pushing way beyond the Alaskan borders.
Yeah, it's a fascinating setup. And it's also a tricky one. Because you're talking to a group of people who, by and large, are not Wall Street traders or corporate leaders. And so they have to kind of learn by doing how to run these corporations. And one of the shareholders at the time was talking to the New York Times and said, they sat us down and said, you're a corporation, now act like one. It would be like setting a bunch of Wall Street people down in the Arctic and saying, now go catch a whale. Right? Like you have a different set of skills, and you have to figure out how to translate those to this new corporate endeavor.
Yeah, having that sort of like financial literacy, if you will, is not something that is just given to people overnight. And so figuring out how you can make the most of the opportunity is still something that requires a lot of information, a lot of guidance, and all of that.
But they make a ton of money.
Yeah, I was about to say, money is big. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars in revenue. 50% of the rankings in Alaska Business Magazine's listing of the top 50 corporations in the state are these Alaska Native corporations. And like any other corporation, they have charitable arms as well. And so they're doing, millions of dollars for scholarships for Alaska Native shareholders and descendants and so forth. So it is, like capitalism, silver linings and clouds. All right. Last thing I think we should mention here is this quote from a man by the name of Albert Kunish, a Tlingit tribe member who, do either of you want to read it?
He says something that I think is really quite profound. He says, it was always about the land. It was never about money. It was never about scholarships. It was never about cultural activities. It was never about non-business issues. It was always about the land. And I think that comes right back to the heart of the matter of when we think about capitalism, it's always about the profit. It's always about how much money you can make. It's about what you can, sort of gain or secure. But for most Native Americans, being able to just control and own the land was central.
Yeah. All right. Well, Travis, thanks again for that email. Really interesting. And I hope we get to do more Alaska stories, more Native stories. But we will leave that there and we will wrap up, as we tend to wrap up, with some also on this days. So we are marking December 14th here is the day that you were listening to this episode. And so on December 14th in 1799, the first president of the United States, George Washington, died in Mount Vernon, Virginia, age 67.
And in 1939, the film Gone with the Wind premiered in Atlanta, Georgia. One of my favorite films until I became an adult and realized how problematic it was.
And Hattie McDaniel, who won the Oscar for Gone with the Wind in that role, but was not invited to the premiere, famously.
Nope.
In 1964, on this day, the U.S. Supreme Court actually put some teeth into the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by ruling that Congress was within its authority to enforce the act against racial discrimination by private businesses. So like hotels and restaurants that tried to discriminate against Black patrons could now be prosecuted by the federal government.
This day in 2012, 26 people, 20 students, 6 adults shot and killed at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut.
And what kind of feels like last week, in 2020, the largest vaccination campaign in U.S. history began with health workers getting shots on the same day as the nation's COVID-19 death toll hit 300,000.
I know it's been 3 years, but man.
I know, it doesn't feel like that.
I'm trying to find the name of that nurse. Who was the nurse? She was from New York, right? It's a nurse from New York, I believe, who got the very first shot. But yes. All right. Well, we will leave it there. We will be highlighting more of these in our newsletter come 2024. So thank you to all of the people who have been signing up for that newsletter. You can do that at thisdaypod.com, where you can also become a member of Radiotopia, find some swag, get yourself a new dad hat or trucker hat or whatever kind of hat or sweatshirt or whatever. All your This Day needs at thisdaypod.com. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.